being here to listen to this talk on multimodal and multi-component lipsmacking in crested macaques. So my name is Jérôme Micheletta, and I'm currently based at the University of Portugal in the UK. So we've heard a lot this morning about communication in great apes and how that's relevant to human communication. I don't think it's a particularly controversial statement to say that human communication is multimodal. We use a variety of signals from all sorts of different sensory modalities. We combine them together, and that allows us to produce a vast range of information, and that's relevant for receivers. For example, we use gestures to emphasize certain words or sentences. Our body posture and position can also provide information about the degree of involvement in conversation or the relative status of the people interacting. And facial expressions can provide an additional layer informing us on the emotional state of the interactants, and maybe also provide some information about the likely behavior of these people. Now, there are other signals that are relevant too, such as touch and olfaction and all sorts of things going on there. And this is important. So the ability to produce, perceive, and accurately interpret all the signals together is probably really important because it provides all sorts of information. And so it's easy to understand why that might be relevant for other species too. Like many other human traits, our communication systems has evolved gradually from natural selection. And so it's relevant to understand how our complex communication system has evolved, what are the selective pressure leading to this communication system, and also whether we can find some precursors in other species like we've heard this morning. Despite this, there's relatively little work done on multimodal communication, especially in non-human primates compared to other animals. So I've mentioned here a few studies, only because these people are present in the audience, otherwise I would totally claim that I'm the only one to do proper multimodal communication studies. But no, I think that it is actually gaining momentum now, and that's great. But if you compare the amount of work that's done in non-human primates, apes and non-apes, to the work done in spiders or frogs or birds and other species, there's relatively little. And then if you consider how facial expressions fit into this pattern, then it's even worse. So facial expressions are often seen as the expression of an internal state. We think of them as some kinds of outburst of emotion that's automatic, that doesn't serve any other purpose. Although, again, this is now being quite seriously questioned, and an alternative or complementary view that facial expression also provide information about forthcoming behavior is now also coming into the front of the stage. For old school ethologists, facial expressions were also really useful because they provided us with a framework to analyze social interactions and social organization. So we've got here the silent bare teeth face in macaques, and that was one of the many elements that allowed us to classify the different macaque species on an increasing scale of social tolerance. So in rhesus macaques, which are labeled as more despotic, the silent bare teeth is a formal signal of submission. It only occurs from subordinate to dominant. And in more tolerant species, like the crested macaque at the bottom, then we don't see this pattern. It seems to be a lot more flexible, used regardless of the dominant status of the individuals and in multiple contexts as well. So facial expressions are traditionally studied as a static, invariant set of components. We usually use pictures that we take at the peak intensity of the facial expression. So, open your mouth and frown and purse your lips, and then you have anger. But actually, we know they are dynamic. We know that slight changes as small as a single muscle contraction can affect the response of the receiver. For example, some of the work that's been done on the full play face versus half play face in gorillas. And we also know that there are changes according to the receiver's behavior, and that's, for example, some work that has been done on orangutans and also with the play face. So we usually focus on a single modality at a time, which is the visual modality for facial expressions, but they are very often accompanied by vocalization. And I don't mean by that the necessary articulatory movement that goes with the production of the sound. Sometimes it's something different, or you have the apparently the same facial movements with different sounds. And then, of course, you have some auditory signals that they have an inextricable visual component. So a male giving a loud call will have to produce these facial movements in order for the sound to come out the way it does. So it is multimodal. And part of the solution to try and overcome those limitations or try to address the problem in a different way is to use a multimodal framework. And the one that I've been using is the one from Sarah Parton and Peter Marler, where signals are seen as either redundant, which means that separately they produce the same outcome, elicit the same response from the receiver. But when you combine them together, then you have the potential for either enhancement or increase of the intensity of the response, or reduction or equivalence, it doesn't matter. Then you have non-redundant signals, which separately produce different response from the reviewer, and when you combine them, then you have a whole new set of possibilities, which is really exciting. You have modulation, or either an increase or decrease in the intensity of the response. You also have independence, so try to convey two types of information at the same time. And then you have kind of the holy grail of communication in primatology, which is trying to find emergence. So when two signals are combined, you actually have a third meaning. Most of the work so far has led to examples of enhancement or modulation. So usually an increase or a decrease in the response. So the aim of our particular study was to look at the lipsmack, which is a common affiliative signals in many primates used to engage in positive social interactions. So we wanted to describe the composition of the lipsmack in crested macaques using a multimodal framework, and we were trying to go into a little bit more detail. That is what usually done. And here you have some illustration of the different components. So you have the neutral state, then the lipsmack, which we will see in the video a little bit later, but it's basically rapid. It's like blowing kisses in the air. And then you have the exposure of the teeth, the head turn, which is a brisk break in the visual contact between the two interactants. And then you have the vocal component, which is a soft grunt. So we wanted to investigate variation in the response of receiver to the different types of lipsmack. So how is the lipsmack composed? So what are the different components that are making up the signals, and does that affect the behavior of the receiver? So here's just a couple of videos to show you how it looks like. So here you have a simple lipsmack. And that's accompanied by the scalp retraction. And then you have a little bit more elaborate. That's the head turn. You can see the exposure of the teeth. And there you have a very soft grunt as well. So it's two quite different facial expressions. So we went to Tongkoko Nature Reserve in North Sulawesi in Indonesia, and we followed two groups of wild crested macaques there. We had 50 focals individual, and we had a minimum of 6 hours of focal data for each of them. So that took quite a while. And we were fortunate enough that we could have two people collecting the data at the same time. So one person purely focusing on gathering the video, and another person collecting data on a handheld computer so that we could get some detailed information about what was going on in the videos. And we collected, I think initially in the data set there was about 850 lipsmacks, but excluding the one that were not complete or not good enough quality to be coded, we ended up with 335. We analyzed that with GLMMs because we knew that, or it looked like the function of the lipsmack was to initiate an affiliative contact. We used that as our response variable. Then we had a bunch of predictors that we were really interested in, which was the number of visual components. Like if you add components on top of each other to make potentially the signal more complex or more intense, is that going to change the response? And then whether you have the soft grunt or not. So if you add the vocal element to the lip smack, is that going to increase the likelihood of contact? Because from our previous work, we also know that there are some social variables that are really important for crested macaques. So we know, for example, that social bonds or friendships affect the way they follow the gaze of conspecific. We know that friendship also affect anti-predator behavior in this species, so we included that in the model. And the duration of the lip smack, obviously, because presumably the more effort you put into producing a long display, the more likely you are to get a response. This is what we found. So we'll start with the number of components. It did not seem like increasing the number of visual components only was having any effect on the likelihood of contact. Now, this is to take with a pinch of salt, because all the categories are compared to one component lip smack, and we had very few of those. With hindsight, I would redo the analysis and use 2 as the baseline, and I think there might be something going on. But what's really interesting is that multimodal, the presence of a soft grunt had the strongest effect. So we were 3.14 times more likely to have a visual contact if there was a vocal component involved in the signal. Also interesting is that, as expected, duration has a positive impact, and that the strength of the social bond is also important in eliciting contact, which is not very surprising because body contact was the dependent variable, and it's also included in the way we calculate the social index. But what's important is that social bond is important, but dominance or rank difference, power difference is not, which fits well with the characterization of crested macaques as a tolerant species. Then we looked at the effect of each component on its own. So we entered the different components in the model to see whether some components had more influence in the outcome. And yes, that was the case. So we replicated the finding that multimodal signals seem to be important in the lip smack, that the strength of the social bond and the duration of the signal also are important. But then we had some surprising findings as well. So the head turn increased the likelihood of contact, but the bare teeth decreased the likelihood of contact. And that was quite surprising, and we'll discuss that in a second. So we start with the soft grunt, which increased the likelihood of contact. So if we think back at Partan's multimodal framework, we are either in the case of enhancement or modulation. So we see more likely body contact. I think it's unlikely that the soft grunt just increased the detectability of the signal, because it's such a low amplitude vocalization. It can only be heard from a very close range. So you would assume that the visual signal is enough. You don't need to add the vocalization on top of that. So instead, it might reflect an increased arousal from the individual lip smacking. Sarah Partan, when she did her studies on rhesus macaques, proposed that the soft grunt possibly was added to reduce the receiver's uncertainty regarding the likelihood of, or the likely following interaction. And so that might be the case in crested macaques as well. Now, the teeth exposure, so I spent quite a lot of time telling you how that fitted with the crested macaques as being tolerant, and in this case, it decreased the likelihood of contact, which is the opposite to what we expected. So in here, we would either be in a case of antagonism or modulation, and quite exciting, potentially emergence. So it is possible that by combining the teeth exposure, the bare teeth, with the lip smack, we end up with a signal that has a different meaning. Or it could be that is more context specific, and that has to do with what happened between those two individuals beforehand. So it could be that these two just had a conflict, and that one individual was trying to approach the other and engage in a reconciliatory behavior, for example, and so there was still some tension in the air, and that could explain why the likelihood of contact was reduced. But that's only speculation. The head turn, again, increased the likelihood of contact. And so here I think it's potentially a clear case of announcement. So the head turn was only produced with the lip smack, so never really on its own. And because it's a movement of the whole head rather than just single features of the face, then that makes the display a lot more obvious. So just to conclude, we've established that lip smacks differ in their composition, so it's not just a single facial expression. You have to try and look at the details and how it's made up to try and understand how it functions. Certain compositions differ in their association with subsequent affiliative contact. And so this bottom-up approach that we've tried to use in combination with the multimodal framework provide a more detailed and accurate look at what is actually going on with this facial expression. And I think this is really important, especially if we consider hypotheses like the social complexity hypothesis for communication complexity, which is also gaining momentum. We know that there's evidence from the vocal domain that the size of the repertoire is associated with group size. We know that in macaques, the number of facial expression increases as the degree of social tolerance increases. But what would be really interesting is to try to put all this together into a multimodal framework and see how that pans out then in relation to social complexity. So what we've been trying to do next is look at different types of facial expressions. So here we have the open mouth Bertie scream, which looks quite similar in different types of contexts, but it's associated with very different vocalizations, very different types of scream. But here we really struggle to make sense of the data because the aggression in this species and the environment that we were collecting the video just made the analysis extremely difficult. We could basically not see the beginning of the conflict and the end of the conflict because they just run away so fast in the dense forest. But I haven't given up on it one day. What I think would be also really interesting, and we are currently doing that, is to combine the multimodal approach with the facial action coding system. So going even further into the details and look at muscle contraction to describe the facial expressions. And we are currently working on the development of a tool that will hopefully facilitate the use of facts across species and how to analyze the data. Because when you use facts, you end up with a huge amount of very detailed data, a little bit like Kat was saying this morning with the gesture, and it can be quite challenging to put that together and to make sense of it. What is really important as well, and that's a point that also Klaus was making this morning, is that we also need to investigate the cognitive mechanisms underlying the production, but also the perception of communication, communicative signals. So we've only focused on the sender so far, and we had the whole program designed to actually use touchscreens and match the sample to see how receivers perceive those different signals, how they put them together. And it took me 3 years to habituate the crested macaques to use that, and we went through individual recognition, facial expression recognition, and then when we were about to start the multimodal studies, the zoo decided that they didn't want them anymore and they shipped them to Ireland. And I was just I was destroyed. I didn't want to do that again. So that's it. There's a lot of people I'd like to thank for making this work possible, either by direct involvement or just inspiration. And thank you very much for your attention.